everybody. Welcome back to the show. Cameron English here with you with the American Council on Science and Health, joined again as always, not as always, most of the time I should say, by Dr. Chuck Dinerstein, our Director of Medicine. Chuck, how are you this lovely fall afternoon?
I'm good. It's a beautiful fall day. It's slightly cloudy but crisp. I'm actually beginning to feel that winter's coming, so I'm thinking that I'm going to turn on my fireplace relatively soon just for that snuggly effect.
Now, are you actually going to turn on your fireplace? Because I was an apartment dweller for some years, and that was actually what you had to do. Today, I'm a little more civilized and I actually get to light fires, but I don't know.
No. I have a relatively new home, and the fire is lit with a switch.
Okay.
Now, it's not an electric fire. It is still natural gas, and it has a fake log with it, but it's the best I'm going to get.
That's okay. I think that's a good, whatever works for you is what I'm trying to say. I love the weather. I love the holidays. I like to put on Christmas music on November 1st. I start listening to Christmas music.
Oh man. Oh, that's real early, but you're right. I can already feel the tug of the holidays because we started to get things together for Thanksgiving. And I know as soon as Thanksgiving comes, it will be Christmas and New Year's. It just gets pulled into this vortex of the holidays.
Yeah. Gotta make your sales before the year end, right?
No, for sure.
Okay. All right. Well, we've got two stories to discuss today. The first one is a piece Chuck wrote. It's called From the Archives, Apple's Alar, NRDC, and Meryl Streep. That's going to be an exciting one. Many things that I deeply dislike in that story. And then we're going to follow up with a piece that I wrote called The New York Times Attacks Great Scientists, Further Tanks Its Credibility. So Chuck, for the younglings in our audience who may not be familiar with Alar or the scandal around it, give us a brief introduction, and then we'll drive down to some specific points.
Well, first of all, they're not alone. This, I would say this was before my time too, and this was actually in the very early days of the American Council on Science and Health, and it came to us from an interested reader who was a graduate of Vassar and attended this Alumni Awards dinner where Meryl Streep, another Vassar graduate, spoke. And what our reader found interesting was that rather than Ms. Streep talking about her very distinguished film career, and nobody can take that away from her, she pointed out that probably the most important activity she had ever participated in was getting Alar removed from the food chain. And she thought maybe we could go back and revisit some of that and talk about it. So with that as a beginning, Alar is a chemical that was used by the Apple industry to prolong the shelf life of their product. And as I was thinking about it the other day, there are a lot of ingredients in our products that some people have objections to that really are there to prolong the shelf life. Another way of thinking about prolonging the shelf life is putting a buffer into the food chain, because the apples, if they're harvested and we allow nature to take their course, we won't be having apples from Washington much past the beginning of November, because they're just not going to last. They're going to rot. So in a similar way, a lot of things, and in this case, Alar, is used to extend the shelf life so that we can extend the food chain for these products, so they have a chance of going from Washington State to wherever you live and be there for a significantly longer time than they would normally. In any case, Alar was a chemical that was used. It was basically sprayed on the crops, and when it was ingested, and that's assuming you didn't wash your fruit, because that would have gotten rid of it completely, it breaks down into a chemical, dimethylhydrazine, which had been found in some animal studies to be carcinogenic. And those animal studies raised some concerns about another young group that was out there, the National Resource Defense Council, the NRDC. And it brought together what might be the template for what we've seen with toxic chemicals in the environment ever since. They brought together some weak science with a very strong, relatable public icon, in this case, Meryl Streep, speaking on behalf of the children, and made a big fuss, went to Congress to try and get this particular chemical banned. The early publicity was sufficient that it basically wiped away most of the earnings from the Washington apple growers, and they voluntarily just got rid of it because they were looking at millions and millions of dollars of losses in sales. But as with many of these things, there was never any strong science to link Alar with any health problems for anyone.
So there's so much to talk about here, and maybe we should start with the fact that the Alar scare, it more or less set the precedent for how you orchestrate a scare campaign around chemicals. And yeah, in my experience today, responding to a lot of this stuff, you see the same model. So you have a well-funded activist group. They have, celebrity endorsements. They have people affiliated with them that seem like experts. They know how to get media attention. They had, at the time for this, they had a public relations firm on board called Fenton Communications, which is sort of, I guess, like a progressive leaning public relations firm. So they work with a lot of activist groups to promote causes that I think most people would consider left or progressive. And this seems to be the way this strategy is run all the time now. I mean, we see this with Environmental Working Group and with Greenpeace. They all do this. And I think one of the keys that you talked about is you had regulatory agencies reviewing the science. You had the companies submitting data to these agencies and then trying to draw conclusions based on the evidence. And then you had these guys just end running the whole process. They said, no, we're going to go to these supermarket chains. We're going to go to the media. And I mean, they carried this with that strategy. So give me your thoughts on that.
Oh, well, I think you're completely correct. It is a great template. In fact, I had forgotten momentarily about the fact that they went around right to the supermarkets, which is really an echo of what you see today with the corporations trying to greenwash their products to curry favor with this political group or that political group. So all of these pieces have come together and have become a well-orchestrated approach to doing it. In fact, if you look at what was said by that PR firm, their goal was to create so many repetitions of the message that you could not avoid hearing it. Obviously, today with the internet, there is a great way to amplify that message. It wasn't available to these public relation firms back in the 70s. I thought it was also interesting because it was really, I think, one of the first times that ACSH, under the direction of Dr. Whalen, took a significant stand that was a contrarian opinion to what was being said in the popular media. And one of the things that I included in there was a little bit of a video presentation by Dr. Whalen talking about Alar.
I really appreciated that. I mean, looking back on it, of course, this was before my time too. It was before I had any interest or any career in science media. But seeing her take that stance and seeing the organization, draw a line in the sand or whatever, dig their heels in and say, no, we're going to push back against this. You can call us what you want, but this is nonsense. And one thing that always bothered me about these kind of campaigns is that, as you alluded to at the top, they say, what about the children? And as a new dad myself, with a rapidly growing toddler, it really angers me, because even as someone who has some background in these public health issues, it's hard to find out or understand what's good for your kid and what's bad for them. Which medicines, which foods, like genuinely difficult questions that you have to invest some time into answering. And then you have these sort of discussions or these sort of campaigns that are just polluting the information that you have access to, especially today with the internet. If you were to look up pesticides on food, on the first page, you're going to get Environmental Working Group, or you're going to get the Dirty Dozen right alongside some reputable sources that will give you good information. Yes. And so I know you have kids as well. They're much older than my son, obviously. But do you share that sentiment? Did you ever have that frustration when you were raising your kids?
Oh, yes. I mean, I think that whenever you hear them making a plea on behalf of the children, we are frequently, not always, but frequently looking at scoundrels. And the way I put it is, while we show great concern for the children with our words, we rarely follow through with that in terms of our deeds. And there's any number of examples. I always like to talk about the pediatricians who are among the least paid of all the medical specialties. And I understand that doctors all do well. But on the hierarchical food chain in medicine, for all the things that we say how important the kids are, the pediatricians get paid the least. And I think that kind of approach is seen throughout society. We are far more interested in speaking on behalf of the children than actually doing anything on their behalf. Yeah, and I would just throw in the fact I just finished editing a piece by Susan Goldhaber, who is going to wind up talking about the latest problem for the children, which is arsenic and lead in baby food, and the class action lawsuits that are being brought on the basis of these metals causing autism in children that eat this kind of baby food, for which there is absolutely no scientific evidence. That should be out this week.
I'm really curious to read that. Anything related to kids and health now, I'm interested in. But I'm also,
it's odd how being a parent will do that to you.
It's ridiculous, man. I mean, it's to the point of absurdity sometimes, because you blow risk out of proportion. And I think, maybe on a biological level, that's healthy to a certain extent, because you're supposed to safeguard your kids against the stuff that wants to hurt them. So that makes sense. But what drives me wild is that these groups know that and they take advantage of it. And to follow up on your baby food example, I wrote an article last year about a report that came out. It was some environmental group, and they had collaborated with a member of Congress. And even when the results show that the food is by and large safe, they just find the one piece of data that is somewhat scary, So like if 97% of the baby food has heavy metals at a level that can't possibly pose a risk, these are naturally found. So like, I believe arsenic is found naturally in rice because it's in the soil where the rice grows.
It's ubiquitous on the planet.
Correct. Right. So in other words, they find it and they say, well, 97% didn't have it at a concerning level, but 3% did. Or they'll say, out of 50 brands of baby food, 47 of them had detectable levels of arsenic. And to the uninitiated parent, that's horrifying. You're like, well, arsenic, that's a nasty thing. I don't want that in my food. And they don't explain it. So anyways, I'm starting to ramble, but my point is that you will discourage people from feeding their kids nutritious food, whether it's baby food or whether it's fruits and vegetables. And then because they're not eating as well, that presents its own health risks. And this has been pointed out. I got this in particular from a risk assessment expert named Dr. David Zurich, who's based in the European Union. But he's pointed this out against all these campaigns, is he says they come out with this information, they scare the hell out of parents, they get the media and they get politicians on board. And then the end result is that you actually have children eating a less nutritious diet So, right, the net effect is harmful after all of your scaremongering. It's just preposterous. Okay, well, I think I guess the takeaway, as always, is just be a little bit skeptical of the media you consume, especially if it comes from NRDC or any of these groups. But speaking of skepticism, I think you need to, look at the media with a raised eyebrow as well. And the latest example that we need to talk about comes from the New York Times, and this was a few weeks ago. They attacked an agricultural scientist. His name is Dr. Frank Mitlerner. He's based at UC Davis, and his work, in large part, is funded by the agriculture industry, and specifically by the beef industry, I think, because he works with them to figure out how to reduce their environmental footprint. And so it's useful work. If you want companies to produce food more sustainably, then this is the kind of thing you need to do. You need them to go to outside experts and say, please help us with this. And you want them to pay for it, because the public should not be paying, to help, a food company sell, more sustainable products. That's just not the way the system is supposed to work. So all that to say, this arrangement, I think, is ethical, and it's not hidden. If you go to Dr. Mitlerner's website at UC Davis, he says very clearly, he says, hey, I work for an organization called the Clear Center. It's funded by the animal agriculture industry. Here's everything we're doing, which is good. That's transparency. That's what's supposed to happen in these situations. But then the Times publishes an article, and they selectively quote Dr. Mitlerner's emails, and then they go to certain universities that are known to be very critical of agriculture, like New York University, interestingly enough. And then they quote people who have fancy sounding titles but aren't experts on the subject. So they'll go to an environmental studies professor, or they'll go to a sociologist that studies media communications or something. And then these people throw these sort of like these passive aggressive insults out there, like, oh yeah, this is what the industry always does. And, they shouldn't do this, but this is what they do. So all that to say, it's ridiculous. It's another example of misleading people, because there's nothing in Dr. Mitlerner's work, which is all published in peer-reviewed journals, and it's presented at conferences that every expert in his field attends. But then you get the Times putting out a story like this, and the implication is, well, he's funded by industry, so he must be bad, which creates all sorts of problems. But I'll stop talking, Chuck. Go ahead.
No, I think that you get a significant problem. We need experts and their expertise to fashion policy, because they're the ones that can look at a problem with enough nuance to weigh out risks and benefits. So I think that there's a reasonable argument to be made that you need to bring experts from a diverse range of opinions together. You get better research, you get better policy. The difficulty comes from the fact that all of those researchers are not working for free, and they all want to be funded. So that there's really two sources of funding. Now, the academic funding comes primarily from government grants, and that would appear on its surface to be relatively unbiased. But the fact of the matter is, when you start looking at how the National Institute of Health or any of these organizations give out grants, is they have older experts in the area looking at the proposals and determining whether they're worth funding. And when that happens, that tends to lead to people funding things that they already have a bias towards believing. And so I think that introduces a bias into the situation that is not necessarily transparent. On the other hand, if you have a researcher that's working for a corporation, you know right away where they're coming from. Their funding biases are clear. So in a lot of ways, experts from corporations are more transparent about their funding, I think, than the academicians. Though the academicians wish to take the high road and say that they're above the fray, when in fact, when you get right down to it, they too have to toe a particular party line if they wish to be successful in getting funding for their work.
And that's what's so amusing to me. And I've mentioned it on another podcast that I do, but you have, even if it's like a private university, you have staff and you have faculty whose salaries are by and large paid by tuition, of course, right? So tuition is usually coming from parents who work in the private sector. Maybe they're wealthy business people, or you have student loans that are underwritten by the federal government. So that's what I always find so annoying, is that these people, their salaries, or government grants, as you just said, right? So their salaries are paid for by people who don't have a choice, because taxpayers don't get to say, I prefer you didn't send my money to such and such university, right? Yes. It'd be ideal. I would love that kind of a setup. So you have these people that have funding from people who don't give it voluntarily necessarily, but then they're going to sit there on their academic perch and they're going to say, well, you can't trust this person because they're in it for the money. And I just find that so hilarious, because I think when it comes to a discussion like this, because meat is, for whatever reason, it's a very incendiary topic. It's very political, and there's ideological commitments in there. You get all these sort of, unspoken battles over capitalism and, what the economic system should look like. Right. There's all these, tangential issues that are associated with this. And so people are fighting about the environment, but really what they're fighting about is the government going to tell me how much carbon I can emit? So that's the underlying discussion, but nobody wants to seem to acknowledge that, especially papers like the Times, especially like these academics. Their focus is, well, the other guys are the bad guys. And that because of where they get their money from.
Right. As we talked a little bit before we got rolling, I think it also has to do with your politics, who you pick out to say is a bad person or is a good person. David Koch is clearly one of the bad people on the planet, because his wealth has come from oil, nasty oil. But as I mentioned to you, he sits on the board of trustees for NOVA, the science program on PBS, and has contributed over $9 million to NOVA. But you never hear anybody questioning the stories being put up by NOVA and suggesting that they've somehow been altered by the monies that they've gotten from David Koch.
It's a striking realization when you see where the money comes from. I believe, and I'm not going to say any names, but I believe the Koch Foundation actually funds a nonprofit that focuses on foreign policy with George Soros, which a lot of people don't know, because when you read the media or you read the coverage of Koch, you're like, oh, these are these billionaire right-wingers that are trying to, destroy our democracy or whatever, but then they'll partner with someone on the left because they have, a mutual cause that they care about. So it's just, I think it goes to show that, the source of the funding, while important and while that can bias the work that you do, you need to be aware that the situation is often more complex. And sort of like what we discussed on the last episode, Chuck, I think the more important thing is we're all honest. And we say, my money comes from this place. I'm starting with these ideological assumptions. Now let's have a discussion and let's get to the bottom of the issue.
Exactly.
Ideally, that's what happens, but it rarely does.
No, it's as soon as you make your bias clear, then you're painted as either a good or a bad person based on how the reader or the person having the conversation with you judges that bias. So it becomes very difficult. People are not interested in actually sitting down and having hard conversations. They're interested more often in just talking past one another and making themselves feel good.
Just one quote to bring out from the story. This is actually from the New York Times, which is, it's crazy that they put this quote in there kind of as like a qualifier on what they were saying, but then they put the same headline on the story. So the Times writes, there is no indication that Dr. Mitlerner or his organization, the Clear Center, violated disclosure requirements. The Clear Center said in a statement that it discloses funding in line with University of California policy. Okay, so right there in my mind, that quote, that defeats the purpose of this story, right? He's not hiding anything. He hasn't violated any ethics policy. Nothing is out of line here. But then the quote goes on and says, but the extent of the private funding and collaboration were not previously known. That, in my opinion, is editorializing, and that should not be in an investigative journalistic report that this ostensibly is. Right now, if you're going to write an article and you're going to say, I have a problem with his funding because he doesn't explain just how much of it comes from industry, that's fine. You can make that argument. But this story is masquerading as an investigation that we did, and I find that very, very frustrating.
Yes, I am very frequently as I'm sitting reading a long science paper. Buried deep into the discussion, there are 2 or 3 lines that completely contradict their findings, that they admit, that the data is skewed or that there's a great deal of uncertainty around it, but it doesn't impact the way they draw their conclusions. It's just craziness. And it does speak to the fact that when you look at a lot of these topics, if you're skeptical, it's worth going back and looking at the primary documentation when you can. I can't tell you how many times it's been far more satisfying to read the entire study than the abstract or a synopsis that somebody else provided.
And you'll be way more informed than the people reporting on the story, I promise you, because they don't do that. And the excuse is always deadline, but as writers, Chuck and I have deadlines too, so I don't buy that excuse. Don't tell me you don't have enough time to investigate something before you write about it, because if that's the case, don't write about it. Go write about something. Write about something else. And if you read the discussion section, as Chuck mentions, in most papers there's a section called discussion, and these are where I call them the come to Jesus quotes, because they're just very, very clear. Like, our hypothesis was this, but the data didn't quite line up exactly as we anticipated, which is an admission in so many words that they were wrong. But no one reads that far into the paper usually. So in any case, a couple things to keep in mind, as always. Just be skeptical of what you're consuming. I think we can just say that over and over, and hopefully people will take up that effort, Chuck. But we're going to leave it there. If you guys want to follow the stories a little more closely that we talk about on this show, just go to our website, acsh.org. You click the subscribe tab up the top, punch in your email there, and 3 times a week we will send you the stories that we write and publish. And then the most popular stories we talk about on the show. So you'll come listen to the show. You go, hey, I know about Chuck's story about Alar because I read it. So you'll be a little more informed. But as always, thank you so much for listening, and we will see everybody next week.